The Argonne Forest, France, October 8, 1918. In a valley choked with the rotting scent of wet leaves and the sharper, metallic tang of cordite, a 30-year-old corporal from the backwoods of Tennessee lay in the mud and made a decision that would defy the laws of probability. His name was Alvin York. To the men around him, he was just a red-haired giant with a heavy accent and a Bible tucked into his tunic pocket. To the sophisticated officers of the American Expeditionary Forces, he was a statistical anomaly, a conscientious objector who had been denied exemption, a man who had spent 2 days and a night kneeling on a mountainside praying for a way out of the killing. But as the dawn broke over the shattered landscape of the Argonne, turning the gray mist into a blinding white fog, York carried a secret weapon that the German army, with all its Prussian discipline and machine gun efficiency, could not calculate. He possessed a terrifying stillness. This was not just any battlefield. This was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the meat grinder, the place where the Allied commanders were feeding thousands of young men into the mouth of the German war machine, hoping to choke it on the sheer volume of bodies. The terrain was a nightmare of ravines, thickets, and hills that had been fortified for 4 years. Every ridge hummed with the sound of Maxim machine guns, their fields of fire interlocking with mathematical precision to create zones of absolute death. The trees had been stripped of their branches by artillery fire, standing like jagged, broken teeth against the sky. The ground was a soup of mud, wire, and the unburied dead. It was a place where courage usually meant dying within 3 seconds of going over the top. Alvin York was not supposed to be a hero. In fact, by the logic of the United States Army, he shouldn't have been an effective soldier at all. Born in a 2-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee, in the valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf, he was a relic of a different time. He had grown up in a world where a man's worth was measured by how straight he could plow a furrow and how true he could shoot a muzzle loader. For years, he had been a hellraiser, a drinker, and a fighter who terrified the local taverns. But a religious conversion had changed him fundamentally. He had become a man of peace, a strict fundamentalist who believed the Bible meant exactly what it said, specifically the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." When the draft notice came in 1917, it tore him apart. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of damning his soul. He had written on his draft card, "Don't want to fight." He had argued with his commanders, not out of cowardice, but out of a deep, agonizing conviction that shooting a man was a sin against God. But on this morning in October, staring into the impenetrable fog of the Argonne, the theological debates were over. York was no longer just a deacon from Tennessee. He was the tip of the spear for the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division, and he was walking into a trap that had been set with industrial cruelty. The mission that morning was suicide in all but name. The objective was the DeKalville Railroad, a supply line that fed the German army. To get there, York's unit had to cross a valley dominated by high ridges. The map said one thing, but the terrain said another. As the Americans advanced, they were walking directly into a funnel. The Germans held the high ground on 3 sides. They had dug into the hillsides, camouflaged their positions behind thick brush, and waited. They were not just soldiers. They were the masters of defensive warfare, veterans who knew every inch of the forest. They watched the Americans stumble through the fog, waited until the trap was full, and then they opened the gates of hell. It started with a sound that York knew well, though he had never heard it like this. The chirp, chirp, chirp of German machine guns. It wasn't the slow rattle of the movies. It was a tearing sound like canvas ripping. In seconds, the air was solid with lead. Men didn't fall, they were erased. The American line, which had been advancing in open order, simply evaporated. Soldiers dove into shell holes, clawed at the mud, or disintegrated under the impact of high explosive shells that began to rain down from a ridge. The confusion was absolute. Officers were shouting orders that no one could hear. The fog mixed with smoke, creating a blinding, suffocating gray soup where the only direction was down. York found himself pinned in the brush, the mud cool against his cheek, his ears ringing with the concussive force of the barrage. To his left and right, the boys he had trained with, the boys who had mocked his prayers and then asked him to pray for them, were screaming. This was the reality of the Western Front, a mechanized slaughterhouse where individual skill was supposed to be irrelevant. The German doctrine relied on volume of fire and interlocking zones. No single rifleman was supposed to be able to make a difference against a machine gun battalion. They had the geometry of death on their side. But the Germans had overlooked something. They were fighting a war of volume. York was fighting a war of precision. Back in the Valley of the Wolf, ammunition was expensive. You didn't fire to suppress the enemy. You didn't fire to scare the game. You fired to hit. One shot, one turkey. One shot, one bear. You waited until the target was clear. You controlled your breathing until your heart beat slow and heavy in your chest, and you touched the trigger with a tenderness that belied the violence that followed. York lay in the mud, and while other men were panicking, firing blindly into the mist, he was watching. He was listening. He was reverting to the hunter he had been before he found God. But this time, he was hunting to save the men who were dying around him. The paralysis of the unit was total. The initial assault had failed. The survivors were pinned down, unable to move forward or retreat. The German fire was coming from the heights, sweeping the valley floor like a scythe. If they stayed there, they would be picked apart by mortars. If they moved, they would be cut down by the machine guns. It was a checkmate, or would have been if Sergeant Bernard Early, facing a desperate situation, hadn't made a desperate call. He gathered a small group of men, 17 privates and 3 non-commissioned officers, including York, and decided to do the unthinkable. Instead of charging the guns in the front, they would try to flank them. It was a crazy plan. It required them to slip through the German lines, climb the ridge through the thickest brush, and attack the machine gun nest from behind. It was a needle-in-a-haystack maneuver in the middle of a fog-bound forest. They moved out, leaving the carnage of the main line behind, creeping through the undergrowth. York moved with a silent, rolling gait of a man who had stalked deer in the Appalachian hardwoods. He didn't snap twigs. He didn't rattle his equipment. He became a ghost in olive drab. As they ascended the ridge, the sounds of battle below drifted up, the screams, the explosions. But up here, in the gap between the German lines, it was eerily quiet. They were walking into the rear area of the German sector, a place where the enemy felt safe. They were behind the wall of sound that was killing their friends. And then, purely by chance, or perhaps by the providence that York prayed for every night, they stumbled upon something that wasn't supposed to be there. They broke through a dense thicket and found themselves in a small clearing. And there, relaxing, eating breakfast, and reading mail, was the headquarters staff of the German machine gun battalion. There were officers, runners, and support troops, dozens of them. The shock was mutual. The Germans, thinking they were miles behind the safe line of their own guns, stared at the dirty, mud-caked Americans. The Americans, expecting to find a few gunners, stared at a platoon of the enemy. For a heartbeat, the war stood still. No one moved. The steam rose from the German coffee cups. The damp leaves dripped water. Then instinct took over. The Americans raised their rifles. The Germans scrambled for their weapons. But the Americans had to drop. Sergeant Early screamed for them to surrender. Realizing they were caught completely off guard, the German major, a man who had been comfortable moments ago, threw up his hands. The others followed. It was a massive coup. Without firing a shot, this small squad of Americans had captured the command element of the enemy force. But the war was not that simple. As the Americans began to disarm their prisoners, organizing them into a column, a shout rang out from the ridge above them. The machine gunners on the hill, the ones who had been slaughtering the American advance, had turned around. They saw their officers being held at gunpoint in the clearing below. They saw the handful of Americans standing exposed in the open. The German gunners didn't hesitate. They swung their weapons around, heavy Maxim guns capable of firing 500 rounds a minute. They weren't looking at the prisoners. They were looking at the threats. They shouted a warning in German for their comrades to drop to the ground. The prisoners hit the dirt. The Americans, realizing too late that the trap had snapped shut on them, stood frozen. And then the hill erupted. This wasn't the distant chirp of the guns they had heard earlier. This was a point-blank execution. A storm of bullets tore through the clearing. In the first seconds of the volley, 6 of the Americans were cut to pieces. Sergeant Early went down with 3 bullets in his body. Corporal Savage was killed instantly. The squad was decimated. The survivors scrambled for cover behind trees, behind the prisoners, anywhere to escape the lead sleet that was stripping the bark off the trees, except for Alvin York. He was on the left flank, slightly separated from the group. When the prisoners dropped, he didn't have time to find cover. He was standing in the open, a tall, lanky target in the mud. The machine gun swiveled toward him. The barrels were less than 30 yards away. By all rights, by every law of ballistics and warfare, Alvin York should have died in that second. He should have been turned into a memory, just another name on a casualty list. But he didn't run. He didn't dive. He didn't panic. As the bullets snapped the air around his ears, buzzing like angry hornets, Alvin York did the only thing he knew how to do. He brought his Enfield rifle to his shoulder. He didn't spray fire. He didn't pray for a miracle. He became one. He looked up at the ridge, saw a German helmet rise above the gun pit, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The battle for the soul of the 82nd Division had ended. The turkey shoot had begun. The distance between Alvin York and the German machine gun nests on the ridge was less than 30 yards. In the vocabulary of modern warfare, this is point-blank range. At this distance, a Maxim machine gun does not just kill, it liquefies. The air between York and the ridge was so thick with flying lead that twigs were being sheared off the trees around him, raining down like confetti. Yet, York did not move his feet. He planted them in the mud, finding the stability he had learned on the steep slopes of the Cumberland Plateau. He did not crouch. He did not weave. He stood upright, a solitary, impossible figure in the middle of a storm. He was holding an M1917 Enfield rifle, a weapon that was heavy, rugged, and in the hands of a master, surgically precise. York didn't think about the politics of the war or the grand strategy of the offensive. His world had shrunk to the iron sights of his rifle and the gray helmets bobbing up from the foxholes on the hill. He went to work. It was a rhythm, a muscle memory ingrained from thousands of turkey shoots back home. See the target. Breath. Squeeze. Recoil. Bolt. The first German gonna raise his head to adjust the traverse of his weapon. Try and bring the stream of bullets onto the lanky American. York's rifle cracked once. The German's head snapped back, and he collapsed over the receiver of his gun. Bolt forward. A second gunner pushed the dead man aside, frantically trying to clear the feed. York fired again. The second gunner dropped. Bolt back. Bolt forward. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an exercise in rhythm. York was Techet-off, a phrase he used later to describe a state of absolute hyper-focused calm. He wasn't spraying bullets, hoping for a hit. He was placing them one by one, with terrifying economy, to the Germans on the ridge. The situation was descending into a nightmare. They were the hunters. They held the high ground. They had the automatic weapons. And yet, every time one of them tried to aim, a single bullet from the valley floor found them. They were fighting a ghost who refused to acknowledge the suppression fire. They shouted at each other in panic, their discipline fraying. They couldn't aim because to aim meant exposing themselves, and exposing themselves meant instant death. So they began to fire blindly, sprays of bullets chewing up the mud around York's boots, passing inches from his face, but miraculously, impossibly, missing the man himself. York, amidst the thunder of the guns, found himself shouting. In between shots, he was yelling at them, his voice cracking with a strange mixture of anger and compassion. "Come down," he screamed. "Give up and come down." It was the plea of the conscientious objector, who was still alive inside the warrior. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted them to stop trying to kill him, so he could stop killing them. But the roar of the battle swallowed his words. They kept popping up, and he kept shooting them down. He fired nearly 20 rounds, reloading with stripper clips with fluidity that made the rifle seem like an extension of his arm. The pile of gray bodies around the machine guns was growing. The German fire began to slacken, not because they were out of ammunition, but because they were running out of men brave enough to man the guns. The terror of the American sniper had seized the line. Then the dynamic shifted. Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, the German commander of the 1st Battalion who had been captured in the initial surprise, was lying on his stomach in the mud near York, watching the spectacle with disbelief. He was a veteran officer, a man who understood the logic of combat. What he was seeing defied logic. One man was dismantling a fortified position. Vollmer knew that if the machine guns couldn't stop York, something else had to. On the ridge, a German lieutenant named Endres came to the same conclusion. He realized that they couldn't win a shooting war with this demon in the valley. They had to overwhelm him. Endres signaled to his men. He gathered a squad of 7 soldiers, seasoned trench fighters. They fixed bayonets, long, serrated blades that turned their Mauser rifles into spears. They were going to rush him. York was busy reloading his Enfield when he saw them. They rose from the brush on the hill, not 25 yards away. 7 men, screaming a war cry, charging down the slope directly at him. They were close enough that York could see the whites of their eyes, the grit on their teeth. They were coming to skew him. His rifle was empty. He had no time to reload. To try to jam a stripper clip into the Enfield would take 3 seconds, and in 3 seconds, the first bayonet would be through his chest. York dropped the rifle to his side, letting it hang by the sling, and his right hand flew to his belt. He drew his sidearm, a Colt M1911.45 automatic pistol. Getty Images, there was a heavy, slab-sided weapon, known for its stopping power. It held 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. 8 bullets. 7 Germans. The leading German was almost on top of him, but York didn't shoot him. In the backwoods of Tennessee, when you are hunting wild turkeys with a pistol, you learn a specific technique. If you shoot the front bird first, the others will see it fall, scatter, and you lose them. But if you shoot the last bird in the line, the ones in front don't know what's happening. They keep coming, thinking they're safe, walking right into your sights. It requires nerves of steel to let a threat come closer while you engage a target further away. But York wasn't thinking. He was reacting. He leveled the heavy pistol and fired past the lead soldiers, hitting the last man in the charging line. The German crumpled. The others kept charging, their momentum carrying them down the hill. Unaware that their rear guard was gone, York fired again, dropping the second to last man. Then the third. It was a display of cold, mechanical efficiency that paralyzed the onlookers. The American prisoners, still hugging the dirt, watched in awe. The German Major Vollmer watched in horror. York was dismantling the bayonet charge from back to front. The lead German, Lieutenant Endres, was screaming, his bayonet lowered, closing the distance, 15 yards, 10 yards, 5 yards. He had no idea he was the only one left. York fired the remaining rounds. The soldiers behind Endres fell one by one, folding into the mud. Finally, as Endres was almost within striking distance, York shifted his aim for the final time. The pistol barked. The lieutenant spun around and fell dead, his bayonet digging into the earth just feet from where York stood. Silence slammed back into the clearing. The Colt slide locked back. Empty. York ejected the magazine and slapped a fresh one in, his eyes scanning for more movement. The smoke from the black powder drifted lazily through the wet trees. The ground in front of him was littered with bodies. The machine guns on the hill were silent. The bayonet charge had been annihilated. Major Vollmer, the captured commander, slowly rose from mud. He looked at the carnage on the hill. Then he looked at the tall, uninjured American standing amidst the dead. Vollmer was a pragmatist. He had seen enough men die for one morning. He walked toward York, his hands raised, his face pale. He spoke in English, a language he had learned before the war. English? Vollmer asked, mistaking York's nationality. American, York said, his voice flat. Vollmer looked at the pistol in York's hand, then up at the ridge where the few remaining German gunners were hesitating, unsure whether to fire or run. The major knew that if the shooting started again, York would kill the rest of them, and likely Vollmer too. If you don't shoot any more, Vollmer said, his voice trembling slightly, I will make them give up. York looked at him. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, making the world look sharp and bright. He didn't want to kill anymore. He just wanted to bring his boys home. He nodded. You blow that whistle, York said, gesturing with the pistol, and you make them come down. Vollmer pulled a small whistle from his tunic. He blew a sharp, shrill blast that cut through the fog. Then he shouted orders in German, his voice echoing off the ridge. Come down. Put down your weapons. It is over. For a long Tense moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. The surviving Americans tightened their grip on their weapons, expecting a trick. York stood ready, his finger resting on the trigger guard of the Colt. Then, slowly, movement appeared on the ridge. Hands rose above the brush. Helmets were tossed aside. One by one, the German machine gunners, the terror of the Argonne, stood up. They climbed down the slope, their hands clasped behind their heads, their faces masks of exhaustion and defeat. They walked past the bodies of their comrades, past a failed bayonet charge, and surrendered to the one man who had defeated a battalion. York watched them come. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply motioned them into line with the other prisoners. He began to count. There were dozens of them. As the realization of what he had done began to sink in, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by a profound weariness. But the danger wasn't over. They were miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by a German army that didn't know yet that its center had collapsed. York had 132 prisoners, only a handful of unwounded Americans to guard them, and a long walk back through hell. "Let's get moving," York said to the survivors of his squad. "And keep a sharp eye. We ain't home yet." He holstered his pistol, picked up his Enfield, and nudged Major Vollmer in the back. "You walk in front with me," York told the officer, "and you make sure your boys behave." They began to march back toward the American lines, a strange, ragtag parade moving through the fog. But as they moved, York realized something terrifying. The artillery was starting up again, and this time it was coming from his own side. The march back to the American lines was a logistical absurdity that bordered on the suicidal. Alvin York was shepherding a column of prisoners that stretched for nearly 100 yards through the twisting, fog-choked ravines of the Argonne. He had 132 German soldiers under his command. To guard them, he had only 7 exhausted American survivors, spread thin along the flanks of the column. The ratio was nearly 20-1. If the prisoners had decided to rush them, if even a dozen of them had realized how precarious the situation actually was, they could have overwhelmed the Americans with their bare hands. York knew this. The other Americans knew this. And in the terrified, shifting eyes of the German regulars, the realization was beginning to dawn. York kept his Colt .45 pressed firmly into the small of Major Vollmer's back. This was the fulcrum upon which the entire operation balanced. Vollmer was a guarantee. As long as the major believed he would die the instant anything went wrong, he would keep his men in line. York walked with a steady, ground-eating stride of a mountain man, his eyes constantly moving, scanning the tree-line, scanning the prisoners, scanning the sky where the American artillery shells were now tearing the air apart. The shelling was a new immediate threat. The American artillery batteries, miles behind the line, had finally received the coordinates for the German ridges. They had no idea that a single corporal from Tennessee had already neutralized the position and was currently walking to the target zone with a battalion of prisoners. The shells screamed in 155mm howitzers that turned trees into splinters and earth into craters. The ground shook with a violence that rattled the teeth. Mud geysered into the air, raining down in heavy, wet clumps on the column. "We got to get out of this," one of the American privates yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar. York didn't panic. He looked at Vollmer. "You tell them to double time," York ordered, his voice calm but hard as iron. "We can't stay here." Vollmer, whose face was a mask of aristocratic terror, shouted the order in German. The column surged forward, stumbling over roots and debris, a gray snake moving frantically through the undergrowth. They were running a gauntlet of their own destruction. It was a chaotic, surreal scene, Americans and Germans running together, ducking instinctively at the whistle of incoming ordnance, united for a few minutes by the shared desire not to be blown into oblivion by American high explosives. As they navigated a bend in the ravine, trying to flank the impact zone, they ran headlong into another complication, a fresh German machine gun nest. These gunners were positioned to cover the rear of the sector, and they hadn't been part of the initial surrender. As the column came into view, the German crew on the guns swung their weapon around, confused by the mass of field gray uniforms approaching them. They hesitated, their fingers hovering over the trigger of the Maxim. If they fired, they would mow down their own comrades. If they didn't, They were letting the enemy pass. York reacted instantly. He jabbed the barrel of the pistol harder into Vollmer's spine. "You tell them to give up," York hissed, "or I'll kill you and them too." Vollmer, seeing the hesitation in his own men's eyes and the absolute certainty in York's, screamed at the gun crew, "Don't shoot. Surrender. Put the gun down." The gunners looked at their commanding officer, then at the tall American standing behind him like an executioner, and then at the massive column of surrendered troops. The psychological weight of seeing their own battalion defeated was too much. The will to fight evaporated. They took their hands off the gun, stood up, and joined the back of the line. The snowball was getting bigger. York was not just capturing men. He was absorbing the German defensive line, rolling it up from the inside out. They cleared the ravine and finally emerged into the scrubby, cratered no-man's land that separated the armies. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the devastation of the morning's battle. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant thumping of artillery and the labored breathing of the prisoners. York organized the column into a tighter formation. He made the German prisoners carry the wounded Americans. It was a striking image. The enemy bearing the men they had tried to kill an hour earlier, bound together by the strange truce of the aftermath. The approach to the American forward positions was the most dangerous moment since the bayonet charge. The doughboys in the trenches were on a hair-trigger alert. They had seen their friends slaughtered all morning. If they saw a wall of German uniforms emerging from the mist, they would likely open fire first and ask questions later. "Hey!" York shouted, his voice booming across the distance. "Don't shoot. I'm bringing in prisoners." A sentry in a forward listening post popped his head up, his rifle leveled. He squinted through the gloom. What he saw defied description. A single American soldier, dirty and unshaven, walking point, followed by an endless stream of the Kaiser's army. The sentry lowered his rifle, his jaw going slack. "Who are you?" the sentry stammered. "Corporal York," he replied. "I got a few Germans here. Where's the CP?" The procession moved through the American lines. The reaction of the troops was electric. Men climbed out of foxholes to stare. Officers ran from dugouts, field glasses dangling from their necks, trying to comprehend the scale of what was happening. It looked less like a patrol returning and more like a parade. The column was so long that when the head of the line reached the battalion command post, the tail was still coming out of the woods. York halted the column in front of the CP tent. He holstered his Colt, adjusted his helmet, and saluted Brigadier General Julian R. Lindsay. The general, a man accustomed to the grim mathematics of attrition, looked at the sea of field gray uniforms huddled under guard. He looked at the pile of surrendered weapons, dozens of machine guns, hundreds of rifles, pistols, trench knives. Then he looked at the lanky corporal, who seemed more concerned about the mud on his boots than the magnitude of his achievement. "Well, York," the general said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief, "I hear you have captured the whole damn German army." York didn't smile. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply replied, "No, sir, I only have 132. The count was official. 132 prisoners. 35 machine guns neutralized, and perhaps most importantly, the German hold on the DeKalb Railroad was broken. The flank had collapsed. York had done the work of a brigade in the span of 3 hours. But as the officers began the bureaucratic process of logging the prisoners and debriefing the survivors, York's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about medals. He wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about the men who hadn't made it back. The boys from the squad who were still lying in the mud of the ravine, their bodies cooling in the October air. Murray, Savage, the others. He felt a heavy, crushing weight in his chest. The Techetov state had vanished, leaving behind the raw, aching humanity of a man who had just walked through fire. He asked permission to go back. "My boys are still out there," he told the lieutenant. "I want to help bring them in." The officer looked at him, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his hand shook slightly now that the adrenaline was gone. "No, Corporal," the officer said gently. "We have stretcher bearers for that. You've done enough today. Go get some chow. Get some rest." York walked away from the command post, finding a quiet spot near a field kitchen. He sat down on a crate, resting his Enfield between his knees. He took the Bible from his pocket, the leather cover worn and stained with the sweat and dirt of the Argonne. He opened it, his fingers tracing the familiar verses. He read, but the words swam before his eyes. He kept seeing the faces of the men he had killed, the way the machine gunner's head had snapped back, the look of surprise on the lieutenant's face as the pistol bullet found him. He had broken the sixth commandment. He had killed. He had done it to save lives. Yes, he had done it because it was his duty. But the reconciliation between the soldier he had become and the Christian he tried to be was a wound that was already beginning to fester. He prayed, there in the noise and mud of the camp, asking for forgiveness, asking for understanding. Lord, he whispered, I hope I did right. News of the exploit traveled up the chain of command with the speed of a telegraph wire. By evening, it had reached division headquarters. By the next morning, it was on its way to Pershing's staff. The Army, hungry for heroes in a war that had produced mostly mass casualties, seized upon the story of Alvin York. They saw a symbol, the reluctant warrior, the backwoods sharpshooter, the embodiment of American individualism triumphing over the faceless German machine. But York didn't know he was becoming a legend. He was just a corporal trying to scrub the cordite stains off his hands. He was assigned to a quiet sector for a few days, a respite from the line. But there was no real rest. The war was still raging. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was grinding on. And York, despite his feat, was still just a cog in the machine. A few days later, a journalist named George Patullo, working for the Saturday Evening Post, heard a rumor about a wild man from Tennessee who had single-handedly whipped a German battalion. Patullo was skeptical. War stories were often exaggerated, inflated by rumors and whiskey, but he decided to investigate. He found the location of the 82nd Division and tracked down the unit. He asked to see the man who had captured 132 Germans. He expected a swaggering giant, a man who bragged about his kill count. Instead, he was introduced to a soft-spoken, red-headed man who looked at his boots when he talked and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. Patullo sat down with York on a log, opened his notebook, and asked, "Tell me what happened out there, Corporal." York thought for a moment, chewing on his lip. He didn't talk about tactics or flanking maneuvers. He talked about the wind. He talked about the way the turkeys moved in the brush back home. And then, in his slow mountain drawl, he began to tell the story of the valley, not as a military action, but as a test of faith. Patullo wrote furiously. He knew, with the instinct of a seasoned reporter, that he wasn't just writing a news story. He was writing a myth. Back in the United States, the war was a distant, bloody abstraction. Families waited for telegrams they hoped would never come. The newspapers were filled with maps of shifting front lines and lists of the dead. The country needed a face to put on the victory. They needed to know that their boys weren't just dying in the mud. They were winning. They were about to get Alvin York. But before the fame, before the ticker tape parades and the medals, there was one more piece of business to attend to. The Army decided to send York back to the site of the battle, not to fight, but to verify. The story was so incredible, the numbers so high, that the top brass wanted confirmation. They wanted a walkthrough. They wanted to see the terrain where one man had stopped an army. So, a week after the fight, York found himself walking back into the ravine. The bodies had been cleared, but the scars remained. The trees were still shredded. The machine gun pits were still there, empty and silent. He walked with a group of officers, including his brigade commander. They asked him to point out where he stood. They asked him to show them where the Germans were. York walked to the spot in the mud where he had planted his feet. He pointed up the hill. "There," he said. "That's where the first gun was. And there, that's where the bayonet attack came from." The officers looked at the distances. They looked at the angles. One of them paced off the distance from York's position to the spot where Lieutenant Endress had fallen. It was barely 9 paces. The officer looked at York, his eyes wide. "You let them get that close?" the officer asked. "I didn't let them do nothing," York replied. "They were coming. I just stopped them." They found the shell casings. Piles of .30-06 brass from the Enfield. piles of .45 ACP from the Colt. The physical evidence matched the story perfectly. It was undeniable. York had stood in the open and outshot a machine gun battalion. The officer stood in the quiet forest, looking at this simple man from Tennessee, and for the first time, they truly understood the magnitude of what had happened. They were standing on holy ground. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. The guns fell silent along the Western Front. It was not a gradual fading of noise, but a sudden, jarring cessation, as if a door had been slammed shut on the apocalypse. For millions of men, the silence was terrifying. They had lived with the constant, rhythmic thumping of artillery for so long that the absence of it felt like a physical pressure in their ears. Men stood up in their trenches, cautiously at first, then with growing disbelief, staring across the cratered moonscape of no man's land at an enemy who was no longer trying to kill them. Alvin York was near the village of Aix-la-Chapelle when the armistice was signed. While the world erupted in a drunken, tearful celebration of survival, York did what he always did. He found a quiet place away from the shouting and the backslapping, and he prayed. He didn't pray for victory. He didn't pray in thanksgiving for the defeat of the German Empire. He prayed for the mothers. He prayed for the empty chairs at dinner tables in Tennessee and in Berlin. The war was over, but the accounting had just begun, and York carried the weight of 25 German lives on his soul, like a sack of stones. He wanted, more than anything, to go home to the valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf, to hang up his uniform, and to return to the anonymity of the plow. But the machine that had sent him to war was not done with him yet. While York sat in the mud of occupied Germany, serving out his time with the tedious duties of the occupation, a printing press in Philadelphia was churning out the instrument of his immortality. George Fatullo's article, titled "The Second Elder Gives Battle," hit the newsstands in the Saturday Evening Post in April 1919. It was a masterpiece of myth-making. Patullo captured the dialect, the reluctance, the religious conviction, and the sheer, impossible bravery of the event. The timing was perfect. America was weary. The war had been won. But the cost had been staggering, and the influenza epidemic was ravaging the homeland, filling graveyards faster than the trenches had. The country was desperate for a story that made sense of the carnage, something that elevated the slaughter into a crusade of righteousness. They didn't want a story about gas attacks and trench foot. They wanted a story about a man of God who smote the Philistines. They wanted Alvin York. Almost overnight, the red-headed corporal ceased to be a private citizen. He became property of the American public. The letters started arriving by the sackful, proposals of marriage, requests for money, offers of business partnerships, sermons from pastors who wanted to know exactly what God had told him in the woods. York, still in France, was bewildered. He read the letters with furrowed brow, struggling to understand why strangers cared so much about a day he was trying to forget. Then came the offers. The sharks smelled blood in the water. Promoters, theatrical agents, and movie producers descended on him before he even set foot on a boat. They offered him thousands of dollars to appear on the vaudeville circuit. They wanted him to reenact a fight on stage, to shoot blanks at actors dressed as Germans while crowds cheered. They offered him endorsements for cigarettes, for rifles, for chewing tobacco. One movie company offered him $50,000, a fortune that a farmer in Pall Mall couldn't earn in 10 lifetimes, just for the rights to his name. York's reaction to this commercial avalanche defined his character more than the shooting ever did. He said no. He didn't just say no. He was offended. Uncle Sam's uniform ain't for sale, he told him. To York, the war was a tragedy, a grim necessity dictated by God and country. To turn it into a carnival sideshow, to make money off the blood of the men he had killed and the friends he had lost, was a sin. It was a desecration. He turned down millions of dollars in modern currency, choosing instead to go home to a life of subsistence farming because his conscience was worth more than their gold. But he couldn't avoid the spectacle entirely. The army, realizing they had a living propaganda poster on their hands, ordered him to Paris. He was feted by generals and politicians. Marshal Foch, the supreme Allied commander, pinned the Croix de Guerre on his chest and told him, "What you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe." It was a staggering compliment from the man who commanded millions. Yet York stood there, shifted his weight from foot to foot, wishing he was wearing overalls instead of a tunic that felt too tight around the neck. Paris was a kaleidoscope of lights and noise, a city trying to dance away the trauma of 4 years of occupation. York walked the boulevards, a giant among the French crowds, signing autographs until his hand cramped. He saw the luxury, the wine, the women, the excesses of the victory celebration, and he felt profound loneliness. This world of marble statues and gilded opera houses had nothing to do with him. He missed the smell of curing tobacco. He missed the sound of the wind in the pines. He missed Gracie Williams, the girl waiting for him back in Pall Mall. Finally, the orders came. He was going home. He boarded the USS Ohioan in late May 1919. The crossing was a strange limbo. On the ship, he was treated like royalty, dining with the officers, while the regular doughboys slept in the hold. He spent hours leaning on the rail, watching the Atlantic roll by, wondering if he could ever really go back. Could a man who had been called the greatest hero of the war just pick up a hoe and start again? Or had the Argonne Forest change him into something that wouldn't fit in the valley anymore? New York City provided the answer, and it was deafening. When the Ohioan steamed into New York Harbor, the reception was unlike anything the city had seen. The harbor was filled with boats, tugs, yachts, ferries, all blowing their whistles, shooting streams of water into the air. Banners hung from the skyscrapers. And on the dock, a roar went up that drowned out the sound of the ship's engines. They took him off the boat and put him in an open convertible. A ticker tape parade. It was a blizzard of paper, white streamers, shredded phone books, confetti raining down from the canyons of Broadway. It reminded him, with a sudden, sharp pang, of the leaves falling in the Argonne when the machine guns cut the branches. But this was paper, and the noise wasn't gunfire. It was adoration. Thousands of people lined the streets. Men in straw hats waved flags. Women threw flowers into the car. They screamed his name. York! 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 He sat in the back of the car, saluting mechanically, a frozen smile on his face. He looked overwhelmed, a deer caught in the headlights of history. He was a Tennessee mountaineer in the city of Babel. The skyscrapers terrified him more than the German army had. They seemed to lean in, trapping him in a canyon of steel and glass. He was paraded to the Waldorf Astoria. He was taken to the stock exchange, where trading stopped so the bankers could cheer him. He met the high society of New York, men in tuxedos and women in diamonds who looked at him as a fascinating curiosity, a noble savage from the hinterlands who had saved civilization. They toasted him with champagne, which he politely refused, asking for water instead. Throughout the whirlwind, York remained a calm center of the storm. He didn't let it turn his head. When reporters asked him about his plans, expecting him to announce a run for office or a business venture, he gave them the same answer he had given in the trenches. "I'm going home to my people," he said. "I'm going to work the land." But the city of New York had one more surprise for him, a moment that cut through the noise and touched the core of who he was. They took him to a banquet, and there, amidst the politicians and generals, they introduced him to a man he hadn't expected to see. It was his mother. The Tennessee Society had arranged for her to come up from the valley to meet him. When he saw her, the small, frail woman in her simple country dress, standing amidst the opulence of the banquet hall, the hero of the Argonne broke. The facade of the stoic soldier crumbled. He rushed to her, ignoring the dignitaries, ignoring the protocol, and hugged her, burying his face in her shoulder. For the first time since he had marched away to Camp Gordon, Alvin York cried. It wasn't the tears of a soldier. It was the tears of a son who had seen the valley of the shadow of death and had been allowed to return to the land of the living. He stayed in New York for a few days, enduring the adulation, but his eyes were always turned south. He had seen the world. He had seen the war. He had seen the great cities. And he had found them all wanting compared to the peace of the mountains. He had one goal left, to get on the train, to watch the buildings shrink away and the trees grow taller, to cross the Mason-Dixon line, and to find the dirt road that led to Pall Mall. He was done with Sergeant York. He wanted to be Alvin again. But as the train finally pulled out of Penn Station, heading south, carrying the most famous man in America back to obscurity, York didn't know that the hardest battle of his life wasn't behind him in France. It was waiting for him in Tennessee. The battle to remain a simple man when the world demanded a monument. The battle to use his fame for something greater than himself. The battle to educate the children of his valley, so they wouldn't have to face the world as unprepared as he had been. The guns were silent, but the fight for Alvin York's soul was entering a new phase. The train whistle echoed off the limestone cliffs of the Cumberland Plateau, a lonely, mournful sound that signaled the end of the long journey from the lights of Broadway to the darkness of the deep woods. It was June of 1919, and Alvin York was finally crossing the threshold back into the 19th century. The iron horse didn't run all the way to Pall Mall. The tracks ended miles away, forcing York to travel the final leg of his odyssey by mule and wagon, climbing higher into the thin, sweet air of the mountains where the roads were nothing more than rutted scars in the red clay. As the elevation climbed, the world of the 20th century fell away. The telephone poles disappeared. The paved roads vanished. The noise of the industrial age was replaced by the sound of wind moving through the hemlocks and the rushing water of the Wolf River. For York, this was not a journey into isolation. It was a return to sanity. The further he got from civilization, the lighter the chest heaved. He breathed in the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the olfactory map of his childhood, and felt the tight, coiled spring inside him begin to loosen. But even here, in the sanctuary of the valley, the war had arrived before him. When he finally reached the valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf, he found that he could not simply step back into his old life. The silence he craved had been shattered. His neighbors, people who had known him as a rough-and-tumble hell-raiser, and then as a quiet deacon, now looked at him with a strange reverence that created a distance he couldn't bridge. They didn't see Alvin anymore. They saw the sergeant. They saw a man who had walked through fire and come back touched by God. And then there was Gracie Williams, the girl who had waited. She was the anchor that had held him steady when the world was trying to pull him apart. Their reunion was the only part of the homecoming that felt real, the only moment uncorrupted by the public spectacle. But even their love was not allowed to be private. The press, hungry for a romantic inclusion to the war epic, had descended on the valley. They camped out on the ridges, photographers lurking in the bushes like snipers, waiting for a glimpse of the hero and his bride. The wedding took place on June 7th, 1919. It should have been a small, sacred affair in the little church where York had found his faith. Instead, it was a state event. The governor of Tennessee, H. Roberts, insisted on officiating. Military brass showed up. Journalists from New York and Chicago sweated in their wool suits, swatting at gnats, scribbling down descriptions of the quaint mountain customs. York stood at the altar, wearing his uniform because the public demanded it, sweating not from the heat, but from the sheer crushing weight of the eyes upon him. He said his vows with the same quiet intensity he had used to command the prisoners in the Argonne, promising to love and cherish Gracie with a fierceness that defied the circus around them. The state of Tennessee, in a burst of gratitude, gifted the couple a farm and a house. It was a grand gesture, a reward for the state's most famous son. But like everything else in the aftermath of the war, the gift came with strings attached. The house wasn't finished. The land title was complicated. And suddenly, the man who had rejected thousands of dollars in vaudeville offers found himself land-rich and cash-poor, responsible for a property he couldn't afford to maintain, living in a spotlight he hadn't asked for. The honeymoon period, if it could be called that, ended almost immediately. The isolation of the mountains, which had once been York's protection, now became a tourist attraction. People began to show up. Not just a few, but hundreds. They drove their Model Ts as far as the roads would take them, and then walked the rest of the way. They walked right up to his front porch, knocking on the door, peering through the windows. They wanted to see the hero. They wanted a souvenir. They wanted him to tell the story. York tried to be polite. He was a man of the mountains, and hospitality was a code as rigid as the Bible. He invited strangers in for dinner. He shook their hands. But it was exhausting. He couldn't plow a field without someone watching from the fence line. He couldn't sit on his porch and read his Bible without a stranger asking him how many Germans he had killed. The valley had become a fishbowl, and York was the prize catch, gasping for air. But the most painful part of the homecoming wasn't the loss of privacy. It was the caricature. The newspapers that had made him a hero had also made him a cartoon. They portrayed him as an illiterate hillbilly, a naive, natural man who shot Germans like squirrels because he didn't know any better. They mocked the dialect of his people. They romanticized the poverty of the region as rustic charm, while ignoring the reality of the hardship. York was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had only a few weeks of schooling, but he was sharply intelligent, deeply thoughtful, and possessed of a profound dignity. He read the newspapers and felt the sting of their condescension. He saw how the world looked at his people, as backward, stupid, and comical, and he realized with a clarity that cut deeper than any bayonet that the real enemy of his people wasn't the German Kaiser. It was ignorance. The boys he had grown up with, the men he had led in the army. They were brave and strong, but they had been sent into the world with one hand tied behind their backs. They couldn't read the maps. They couldn't understand the orders. They were at the mercy of a world that used words as weapons. York looked at the children of the valley, shoeless, working in the fields when they should have been in school, destined for the same hard, limited lives as their parents, and he felt a new mission taking shape in his heart. He didn't want a statue. He didn't want a medal. He wanted a school. This realization marked the transition of Alvin York from a soldier to a statesman of the soil. He began to talk about education with a fervor that confused the people who just wanted to hear war stories. He wanted to build a high school in the mountains, a place where mountain children could learn agriculture and industry, where they could get a modern education without having to leave their homes and lose their culture. He wanted to give them the tools to fight the battle he was currently losing, the battle for respect. But schools cost money, a lot of money, and the state of Tennessee, despite its parades and promises, was broke. The politicians nodded and smiled when York talked about his vision. They clapped him on the back and called him a visionary, but when he asked for appropriations, the checkbooks remained closed. They wanted the hero York. They didn't want a reformer York. So Alvin York, the man who had turned down millions to play a soldier on stage, decided to do the one thing he swore he would never do. He decided to go back out into the world and sell himself. But this time, the uniform wasn't for sale, it was for rent, and the proceeds would go to the children. He began to accept speaking engagements. He joined a Rotary Club circuit. He traveled to cities he hated, slept in hotels that smelled of coal smoke and stale cigars, and stood on stages in front of thousands of people. He was not a polished orator. He didn't wave his arms or shout. He stood still, hand behind his back, and spoke in that slow, quiet mountain voice. He told them about the war, yes, because that's what they pay to hear. He told them about the turkey shoot and the machine guns. But then, just as the audience was leaning in, satisfied with their blood and glory, he would pivot. He would talk about the roads in Fentress County. He would talk about the lack of books. He would talk about the shame of a nation that would spend billions to kill men in Europe, but wouldn't spend a dime to educate children in Tennessee. He turned the celebrity culture against itself, using his fame as a battering ram to shame the wealthy into giving. It was a grueling existence. He was living two lives. The simple farmer who just wanted to grow corn and raise a family with Gracie, and the public figure who had to shake hands with donors and argue with bureaucrats. The stress began to show. His red hair began to gray at the temples. The lines around his eyes deepened. He was fighting a war of attrition against indifference. The project he envisioned was massive, the York Agricultural Institute. He wanted it to be the best school in the state. He wanted brick buildings, modern laboratories, buses to bring the children down from the hollers. The skeptics said it was impossible. They said the mountain people didn't need that kind of education. They said he was dreaming too big. But they had said the same thing about capturing a machine gun battalion. By the mid-1920s, York was deep in the trenches of local politics and fundraising. He was finding that navigating the bureaucracy of the Tennessee Board of Education was more treacherous than the Argonne Forest. In the forest, you knew who the enemy was. He was the one shooting at you. In politics, the enemy smiled at you, promised you support, and then cut your funding in a committee meeting when you weren't looking. He faced betrayal from people he trusted. He faced ridicule from newspapers that accused him of mismanagement. He faced the crushing reality that being a hero didn't make you a good administrator. He made mistakes. He trusted the wrong people. He went into debt personally to keep the dream alive, signing notes he couldn't pay, mortgaging the very farm estate had given him. There were nights when he sat by the fire with Gracie, his head in his hands, wondering if he had made a mistake. It would have been so easy to take the movie money. He could have been rich. He could have moved away. He could have left the valley to its fate. But then he would look at his own children, growing up in a world that was changing faster than anyone could predict, and he knew he couldn't stop. The soldier of the Argonne had laid down his rifle, but he had picked up a heavier burden. He was carrying the future of his community on his back, trudging up a hill that seemed to have no top. And as the roaring 20s began to fade and the shadow of the Great Depression lengthened across the country, Alvin York was about to find out that the hardest times were not behind him. The economic storm that was coming would threaten to wash away everything he had built, testing his faith in ways that the Germans never could. The Great Depression hit the Valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf like a hammer blow. By the early 1930s, the poverty that Alvin York had fought to eradicate had deepened into desperation. The York Agricultural Institute, the brick-and-mortar manifestation of his dream, stood open, but was a fortress under siege. The state funding dried up. The political promises evaporated. York, determined that the doors would never close on the children of the mountains, began to pay for the buses, the teachers, and the coal out of his own pocket. He mortgaged his farm, then he mortgaged it again. The hero of the Argonne was drowning in red ink, fighting a battle against bankruptcy that no amount of marksmanship could win. But as the decade wore on, a shadow darker than the Depression began to stretch across the Atlantic. In Europe, the old enemy was rising again. Adolf Hitler was rearming Germany, and the world was sliding inexorably back toward the abyss. For York, this was a spiritual crisis. He had spent 20 years telling people that war was a tragedy, that the killing he had done was a grim necessity never to be repeated. He had become a vocal isolationist, believing that America should never again send its sons to die in foreign mud. But York was a man who looked at the world with clear eyes. He saw the newsreels. He saw the persecution of the Jews, the invasion of Poland, the fall of France. He realized with a heavy heart that the devil he had fought in the Argonne had not died. It had merely changed its uniform. In a moment of profound courage, he publicly changed his mind. He stepped forward and declared that sometimes, to preserve peace, a man must be willing to fight. It cost him the support of many pacifists and isolationists, but York had never cared about popularity. He cared about what was right. It was in this context, with the world on the brink of fire and his own finances in ruin, that the movie producer Jesse Lasky finally broke through York's defenses. For 2 decades, York had said no to Hollywood, but now he needed money to save his school, and he believed that a film about his life might help prepare America for the war that was coming. He agreed, but with conditions that were quintessentially Alvin York. No girls, no glorification of killing, and the man playing him had to be Gary Cooper, the only actor York felt had the quiet dignity to represent the mountain people correctly. The film, Sergeant York, was released in July 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. It was not merely a movie, it was a phenomenon. It became the highest-grossing film of the year, and won Gary Cooper the Academy Award. But for Alvin, the premiere in New York was a strange, out-of-body experience. He sat in the dark theater, a gray-haired man in his 50s, watching a tall, handsome actor relive the most terrifying moments of his life. He saw the muzzle flashes, heard the screams, saw the digital ghosts of the men he had killed. When the lights came up and the audience erupted in applause, weeping and cheering, York sat still. He wasn't thinking about the box office. He was thinking about the school. The money from the film paid off the debts. The Institute was safe. He had traded his life story for the future of his neighbor's children. When the United States entered World War II, the old warrior tried to enlist. He was 54 years old, overweight, and suffering from arthritis. Yet he walked into the recruiting station and offered his rifle. The Army gently declined his service in combat, but used him as a symbol. He toured training camps, visiting the terrified young boys who were about to face their own Argonnes. He didn't tell them war was glorious. He told them to trust in God, to shoot straight, and to look out for the man next to them. He was the bridge between the generations, the living proof that a man could walk through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side. But the post-war years were not kind to the body that had endured so much. The stress, the travel, and the relentless pressure being Sergeant York took their toll. In 1948, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage that left him bedridden. The giant of the mountains, the man who had climbed ridges and marched prisoners, was now confined to a room in the stone house the state had given him. For 10 years he lay there. The world outside accelerated. The Korean War came and went. The atomic age dawned. Presidents changed. But in the room in Pall Mall, time slowed down. Gracie, his rock, sat by his bedside, reading to him from the Bible. The crowd still came, tourists driving up the winding roads, hoping for a glimpse, but they were turned away. The hero was tired. He watched the sun move across the floorboards. Listening to the sound of the farm, he could no longer work. He didn't talk much about the war in those final years. He talked about the school. He asked about the students. He wanted to know if they were learning, if they were graduating, if they were making something of themselves. That was his victory. Every diploma handed out at the York Institute was a redemption for the lives he had taken in 1918. On September 2nd, 1964, at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville, Alvin York finally laid down his burden. He was 76 years old. The cause of death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage, but in truth, he had simply worn himself out in the service of others. They brought him back to the valley one last time. The funeral was attended by generals, governors, and thousands of weeping mourners. They buried him in the red clay of the Wolf River Cemetery, just a short walk from the church where he had first found God. The tombstone was simple, but the legacy was complex. History remembers Alvin York for what he did on a single morning in October 1918. It remembers the 132 prisoners, the 25 dead Germans, the Medal of Honor. It remembers the math of the battlefield, one man against a battalion. But that is the small story. That is the story of a soldier. The true story of Alvin York is the story of the 45 years that followed. It is the story of a man who was offered the world, fame, fortune, power, and rejected it all to go home and build a school. It is the story of a man who understood that the greatest courage is not found in taking a life, but in building one. Today, if you drive through the winding roads of Fentress County, Tennessee, you will pass the York Agricultural Institute. It is still there, a bustling high school filled with teenagers who text on smartphones and dream of the future. Most of them know the name on the building, but few truly understand the price that was paid for the bricks and mortar. They are the living legacy of the corporal who put down his rifle and picked up a plow. In the end, Alvin York proved that the sample script of a life is not written in the moments of high drama, but in the quiet, stubborn dedication to doing good. He was a warrior who hated war, a celebrity who hated fame, and a hero who just wanted to be a neighbor. In a century defined by industrial slaughter, he remained defiantly, beautifully human. He was the candle that wouldn't go out in the wind of the Argonne, and the light he kindled in the mountains of Tennessee burned still. If the story touches you, kindly subscribe, like, and share this story.